Welcome back to Roundup Reddit. Today, we have a captivating tale about a unique job collecting the secrets of the dead. Let's jump right in. The Death Collector. I collect the secrets of the dead. Sorry, I've never been good at starting a conversation. My aunt used to tell me I speak in headlines, where I say the most eye-catching thing first before I explain the rest. I guess I never got any better at it, but I can promise you that it's the truth. You see, when I was younger, I was tasked with the unpleasant responsibility of clearing out my father's apartment after he died. We hadn't been close for a number of reasons I'd rather not get into this early. But my dad had no spouse, and I was his eldest child. And my brother was taking the whole thing too hard for me to feel good about passing things off to him. So it was up to me to clear out the home of a man I hadn't seen or even spoken to in, 13 years. I found a lot of things while cleaning out that apartment that I honestly would have rather not known about. The pictures of me and my brother on his dresser. The letters from lovers who somehow saw something in that man that I couldn't understand, along with some pretty graphic descriptions. Scribbled notes about things that I remembered and things I didn't at all. The ones I didn't remember were the worst. They usually are. When it was done, I remember wishing that someone else could have done it, that someone who didn't know him had done the job of digging through his life without the added pain of knowing the man. And I decided I'd do that for others. To give you an idea of what my job entails, I'll start with my very first job and the secrets that came with it. It started small. I handed out a makeshift business card that wasn't even laminated to the funeral home that had taken care of my father after I explained my plan to the owner. He was surprisingly supportive. I still appreciate that support to this day, where I still get customers that Anthony had sent my way with a glowing recommendation. I emphasize that I don't do crime scenes, that I can do hoarding cases, and a general overview of my services. It was definitely a surprise when I got my first client the next week. The caller was a sweet but anxious girl, barely 18, who had been saddled with her mother's estate with no grandparents or siblings who could help her. The poor thing seemed like she was jumping from thought to thought and emotion to emotion throughout the whole call. At one moment, she would be crying and sharing her regret that they hadn't been close, and the next, she would be cursing up a storm over the fact that her mother had had one last fuck you by making her daughter take care of all of her belongings. I let her go without interrupting, aside from some gentle validation when she seemed to need it. Eventually, she asked me if she could come to my office and fill out a form for the apartment to be cleared out. I hadn't thought that far yet. I didn't have an office. I didn't even have any forms. So I made a rough one up in the middle of the night and asked Anthony if I could use one of his conference rooms, for lack of a better name, to meet her in. Again, he agreed. God, the more I think of those early days, the more I realize I owe him big time for all his help. But that's beside the point. The next day, she met me at the funeral home after another call about the meeting place, and we discussed what she wanted. Here's a rough approximation of what my sleep-deprived brain came up with in the middle of the night. Consent form for services rendered. In terms of furniture, I would like to keep the following furniture, and the rest may be donated or disposed of. In terms of personal belongings, I would like to keep the following items, and the rest may be donated or disposed of. In terms of sentimental belongings, photos, notebooks, letters, etc., I would like to keep the following items, and the rest may be disposed of. If there is any uncertainty about what should be done with belongings, I can be reached at I have understood the information provided to me and agree to the discussed price of dollars based on labor and size of living space in SQ of feet. Signature and the form was rough to say the least, but it got the job done, and I honestly haven't had to change it much over the years. I told her the baseline price I was charging per square foot and the added price per hour of labor, and she agreed without a second thought. Clearly wanted to be free of the task, and I didn't blame her. Although the first day of this job was light, it was a good tone setter for my work moving forward. Bright and early the next day, I set off for the address I was given with a sense of nervous excitement. This was the first day of a potential career, one that didn't involve retail work, 5 days a week, and if it worked out, I was confident I could support myself doing this instead. I'd done some research on the prices using what similar services I found, and if I did well, then I would have a better life, even if it was dealing with a lot of death. When I pulled up, I wasn't really sure what to think. On first glance, the apartment looked normal, nice even, but the more you looked at it, the more you noticed the odd details. Newspaper over one of the windows, a crack in another, what looked like scratches around the doorknob. The feeling around it was odd too. I'd come to know that this was just the feeling of going into a house, has no resident any longer, but at the time I was just kind of freaked out. Regardless, though, I had to go in. I already had my game plan. First clearing out all the trash, then the small stuff like paperwork, then the appliances and such, then the furniture. Being prepared like that always calmed my nerves in new situations, and it certainly did that here as I unlocked the door, took a breath, and went in. It was disgusting in there. More flies than I would have imagined, and the smell was, it was horrible. Rotting food, cigarette smoke, cat pee, and cat pee? I racked my brain for a second about the meeting. I was sure I brought up pets. It's something I usually do for small talk and to make me and the other person comfortable. She said she didn't have any, that her own rental agreement didn't allow it, and that I wouldn't need to worry about letting any out when I went to this apartment. Then, why was there cat pee? I put on a mask I had in the backpack for the cleaning part of the job to help dull the smell and started investigating. If there was an animal in the home, that was my first priority. Cans of food in trash, a single squeaky mouse, an overfull and filthy litter box, and a bathroom mat that seemed to have substituted in the meantime. I started calling, making awkward kissing noises, and after several minutes, received the most pitiful meow I had ever heard from the living room. I laid myself as flat as I was willing to on the filthy carpet to look under the couch and met eyes with a thin, scruffy, furred black cat with the widest yellow eyes I had ever seen. "Hey there, little guy," I cooed, trying to coax him out. The cat hissed and tried to make himself smaller and scoot as far from me as possible. I frowned and pushed myself up to look around the kitchen for any food that wasn't rotten, or ideally that was legitimate cat food, and was fortunate to find a can of wet food that had been knocked over behind a few expired cans of corn. "You hungry?" I asked, trying and failing to find a clean plate, with there being some evidence that these had been what the woman was using for the cat's food. At the rustling in the kitchen, the cat had poked his head out ever so slightly from the couch, revealing a small black nose and light whiskers. It made a little chirping noise that at the time I didn't understand, having been raised with dogs all my life, and when I set the can down, he wasted no time running at it and eating so fast that I was worried he would hurt himself on the can. I might as well have left for all the care he had towards me as he devoured his food, and as I watched him, I noticed the poor thing's ribs showing. "How long were you here alone?" I asked him, mortified. Even if he could answer, I don't think he would have. He was clearly very busy, making up for lost meals. I let him be as I stepped away to call the client. After a few rings, she answered, sounding confused. "Hello? Hi, Amy, it's Dawn. You have a sec?" There was some muffled shuffling as she moved to a different area, signaled by a door shutting. Sure, what's wrong? There wasn't anything I wanted aside from valuables or cash. There's a cat here." Silence for a moment. "What? A cat? It looks like your mom had a cat." A longer moment. "Just bring it to the shelter. I know you can't have one based on our conversation, but maybe a friend or just get rid of it. I don't care where it goes. I don't want it. I don't want to see it." There was something almost desperate in her voice, and it kept me from arguing. The tone told me I probably didn't want to know why she was so against this poor animal. I looked to him as I answered gently, "Since you don't care where it goes, could I have him?" She seemed taken aback for the briefest of moments before answering quickly, "Yes, if you could, please. I'm sure you'll have a better home than that one." Yeah, I definitely do." "Good. Then, is there anything else?" "No, miss. Nothing else. I'll let you know if I find any valuables or cash." "Thank you, Don." I hung up and looked at the cat as he scratched at the now empty can, hoping he had missed something. At least I'd have some company while I finished the first part of the job, and when I went home, I'd see what I'd signed up for. I still don't know why I volunteered myself at that moment. Something about that cat. I felt for him, maybe saw something in him that called out to me. Or, of course, I could just be romanticizing things after the fact. Either way, now that he had some food in him and knew I was the one that gave it to him, he followed me around as I got out the box of garbage bags and a pair of gloves and started piling handful after handful of garbage into bag after bag. Expired cans of food, rotten meat that had been in the fridge for God knows how long, plates so caked with mystery food and mold that it was easier to throw them away than try to clean them up to donate, several full ashtrays, a few handfuls of used tissues, several TV guides from over a decade prior, adult item that I was thankful I was throwing out instead of that poor girl. Little by little, the floors and surfaces were exposed, my new buddy sitting and watching me or meowing at anything resembling a can. He seemed particularly confused by the ashtrays since they were roughly the size of the can of cat food and were clearly being emptied into the bags, and at one point even growled when I refused to set it down for him. By the time the garbage alone was done, it was dusk. A whole day just cleaning out all the trash, and more garbage bags than I had been prepared to deal with on my first job. In the future, I would always rent out a dumpster as a precaution, but this time, I would have to take a few bags with me each time I left the house. I still remember the smell and how it didn't leave my car for days, but the cat got in no problem. Even let me carry him out after I'd gotten the last bag, and sat in that seat just like the German Shepherd I'd grown up with. I named him Lucky. I went back to the house the next day while Lucky was asleep in what used to be the bed for my aunt's Boston Terrier. I really appreciate how quick she brought it once I said what happened. My goal that day was simple enough: pack up anything that wasn't an appliance or furniture and divide the donatable from more trash. I didn't know it then, but this would end up being my favorite part of the job. This was when you start finding the real secrets. At first, things were simple enough. I hadn't thrown out any legible papers in case there was something on them that Amy would need for the estate side of things, so I started there. Some of it was boring, of course. Half-finished to-do lists, numbers for God knows who scribbled on junk mail or old bills, doodles of varying quality. If I remember right, my favorite thing in those categories was a really abstract-looking drawing of a chicken, but there were a few little gems already peeking through in this pile. On a piece of paper labeled the New World Testament, there was an odd series of symbols or numbers. The symbols varied from what looked like meaningless jumbles of lines to small shapes to vaguely religious ones like a cross with a halo or a star with wings. It clearly had some value since it had been kept safe from the mess left on the kitchen table, but whatever it was had been lost on me. The lines of numbers and symbols were in clearly defined paragraphs and sequences, and I probably spent way too long trying my hand at code breaking before giving up and moving on, setting the paper aside. On the same table was a Bible with dog-eared pages, a lot of them in the Book of Revelations or the Old Testament. I wasn't exactly the religious sort, but I'd been raised Catholic and recognized bits and pieces. That got set aside too. When I moved on to the bedroom, the possibly useful separated from the less than helpful in a recycling bag, it was what I'll affectionately refer to as haunting sensation. Bedrooms are the best place for secrets and the worst place for peace of mind in a job like mine. Too easy to get a sense of the person whose life you're clearing away. A Snoopy stuffed animal, a few crosswords and word searches. The sizable cluster of pills, on the other hand, was at least more detective work than grave robbing for me. They were mostly the same kind aside from some almost empty bottles of olanzapine. Multivitamins, metformin, and vitamin D pill bottles were emptied and sometimes on their side, as if grabbed haphazardly. A Snoopy stuffed animal. A few crosswords and word searches. The sizable cluster of pills, on the other hand, was at least more detective work than grave robbing for me. They were mostly the same kind, aside from some almost empty bottles of olanzapine. Multivitamins, metformin, and vitamin D pill bottles were emptied and sometimes on their side, as if grabbed haphazardly. The several bottles of risperidone, however, seemed untouched. Since there are regulations on medications that make disposing of them a bit harder, I counted the pills left in the bottles that weren't empty, and while there as only one bottle of olanzapine with more than a pill or two, there was either the same number or none at all missing from the risperidone. No idea what they were for at the time. Didn't think it was right to look it up. Another chunk of time taken up with the personal bits passed before I found anything that caught my curiosity. As I mentioned, I try not to worry about appliances until later, but sometimes the smaller ones get gathered during the hunting bit. One of these was an old radio cassette player that I was shocked still worked when I tested it. And when I opened the cassette deck to see if there were any tapes in it, there was instead almost a dozen thinly folded notes stuffed inside that nearly popped out once it was opened. I mean, who could blame me for focusing on that instead? I unfolded the one at the back of the pile, hoping it was the oldest, and started to read. It's been 4 days since God blessed me by speaking to me again. I missed him so much I thought he had abandoned his most faithful servant. But it was the poison those madmen gave me that did it. They tried to cut me off from our Lord and keep me from preventing the end times. Agents of the devil, that's all they are. But I forgive them. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those that trespass against us. Though they lost their way, I will not. He told me today to begin transcribing his teachings into the language of angels, and I decided to also log the journey for myself, for the future disciples, to see how I struggled in the name of our Lord. I will not fail you. I frowned and looked back at the Bible, and the paper filled with code on the table, wondering what these teachings were, before grabbing another. As I did, I jumped as the radio crackled to life a moment and uttered a few garbled words before going quiet again. I must have hit the button, was all I could think to say, to reassure myself as I continued. The agents of the devil have realized my mission. I've seen them at the window of my room, trying to listen in to the teachings of the Lord. They want to stop me. They want to sever my connection with him again. They want the Antichrist to rise unopposed. They won't falter me. They can't have my soul. He told me how to protect his words and his teachings from prying eyes. I will bombard them with the false news of the false idols, plaster it to distract them, and protect our future salvation. Lord, protect your faithful servant, and trust that I will follow your will. False news of false idols? What the hell did that mean? As I looked at the windows, I finally noticed that they were covered with newspapers the same way one of the windows in the front had been. I got up for a second and looked to see which of those front windows had been covered and realized it was directly behind one of the kitchen chairs. I couldn't remember if that chair had been the one where the code and the Bible had originally been sitting, but it was likely a safe bet considering what I'd read. I sat back down and grabbed another, and was again interrupted by the radio crackling to life, this time somewhat intelligible, protect his children from. I leaned in a bit, wondering if maybe it was some kind of religious broadcast that was feeding into these notes. The Lord shields you from the devil's gaze. There was a loud smacking noise at one of the windows, and I let out what I'm sure could have been mistaken for a little girl's scream. In the subsequent scramble to my feet, I knocked over the radio, and it again fell silent. Worried that a bird had hit the window, I put the note I was still holding in my pocket and headed outside to investigate. No bird, thankfully, but I almost wished there had been, because on this side of the glass was the clear smudge of a hand and a slight crack that hadn't been there before. Then again, it's not like there wasn't a broken window on the front side of the house. Maybe a kid had noticed someone was in the house and decided to mess with them. I frowned at the thought. If it was then, they certainly hadn't helped this poor woman's mental health with their bullshit. With one more lap around the house, just in case I returned to the woman's room to keep reading, I have decided to keep my logs within the vessel of the Lord to further protect them from the prying eyes of the devil's servants. They cannot open the vessel. I have blessed it with the Lord's guidance. As I have listened to his teachings, I was told to begin collecting animals, as the world would be bathed in cleansing fire, much like the flood of old, and need to be reborn anew. I have been busy with my work, but the Lord has helped me in this task by sending me one of his children. The creature has no name, as I'm only housing him for the new world, but I care for him as I would my own in the name of his glory. I am your faithful servant, Lord. I follow your word to the letter. So, that's why Amy didn't know about the cat. He must have been a stray that was just in the wrong place at the wrong time and ended up entangled in whatever this woman had believed. As for the vessel, I could only assume she meant the radio. After all, that was where the notes had been. As if on cue, the thing crackled to life a third time, scaring me a bit less this time around, and it was even clearer than before. As the time of reckoning approaches, heed the signs of the devil's work. He will try to tempt you, as he once tempted Eve, and will slowly drag you to hell with him and away from the healing light of the Lord. Do not be tempted, my child. Heed the signs, and do not walk the path of sin. Do not eat the apple a second time. Something about the words made me feel a bit ill. Those radio pastors sure have a way with their fire and brimstone talk. He had an undeniable charisma that made it feel as if he were speaking to me personally, rather than who knows how many listeners. As it died again, I promised myself I'd change the station if it came back on. I have received another blessing. I no longer need to sleep, and as his son before me, I am no longer tempted by simple food and water. I can focus on my work. The end is coming. I must stop it. I must save Amy. For some reason, at that moment, all hell broke loose. The radio kicked on at what had to have been its max volume, with something between a screech and deafening static as the windows shook from the impacts on them from outside, a few pictures falling off of the wall they shared. I clamped my hands over my ears, overwhelmed by the noise and my racing heart. God, maybe this woman had been on to something, because it sure as hell felt like the world was ending in that moment. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I removed my hands shakily to check the radio, terrified of the idea of it making that horrible noise again. One of the notes that had still been in the tape deck was somewhat singed, presumably by the electricity that surged through the radio, and another had actually been burned through where it had made contact with the inner workings, making it impossible to read. When I checked the photos for what fell, the two of the five that had were of a young girl I assumed to be Amy. I stopped at that note. That was enough to tell me that these were not something Amy needed to see, not that the earlier ones had done some convincing already. I carefully folded each note and put it back in the radio before considering the thing. I could just throw it out, of course, along with the now meaningless teachings and the Bible verses that inspired them, but it felt wrong. In her last days, this poor woman was lost in her frantic quest to serve God and save her daughter, and if I threw these things away, then all that pain would be for nothing. At least, that's how I felt about it. God, thinking about my decision, after all, that makes me sound like I was asking for a poltergeist or a ghost or something, but kept it. I kept the radio, the notes, the code, and the Bible. As I finished the rest of the job and gave Amy the paperwork she hadn't known she needed as a first-timer, I settled these items in my home along with Lucky and, out of respect, made a label for the radio that had the woman's name on it, Teresa. I would keep this habit with future finds, labeling things with the names of the dead who owned them, and it's become a kind of ritual to show these people respect as I hold on to their secrets. It still kicks on now and again, but it hasn't screeched at me or destroyed any of the notes as far as I can tell since that day. Every time it does, I try to change the channel, but the damn thing won't let me. It's usually a few snippets from the radio pastor, but every once in a while there's a woman with a gentle voice talking about forgiveness and the Lord's kindness. It's only happened 2 or 3 times where it was that voice, but I definitely prefer it. God, that ended up being a lot longer than I thought. It feels better to talk about these than I expected. Friends and family don't exactly want to hear about a job like mine more than the bare minimum, and this is the first time I've felt like I can share some of my finds without risking someone discovering who the secrets I've collected are from. Thinking of who to talk about next, though, is surprisingly hard. I guess for anyone who wants to hear more, just give me a name or a question about my job so I can narrow things down. I can promise you, things only get more strange from here. Shit, maybe talking about Teresa was a bad idea, at least so close to the radio. I can hear the fire and brimstone preacher talking about the devil's work, and it always feels directed at me somehow. Maybe tonight I'll keep the museum locked again, just in case. Part 2, the death collector. After my last post, I've been working on 2 things, aside from my job, of course. The first is making a list of the people who have a spot in my museum. The second is keeping Lucky out of it. I should probably elaborate on the latter. In my last post, I mentioned that Teresa's radio was on, and and preaching one of its sermons when I finished up her story. What I didn't mention is that it's the loudest it had been in quite a while, and a bit more aggressive. At the very least, it felt more targeted and accusatory than usual. Almost beyond fire and brimstone, it felt like the end times. So I went to lock up the museum after and give her a chance to calm down when Lucky raced past me into the room. I don't know what came over him. He's always been pretty careful with the things in there anytime he followed me in, but this time he rushed at the radio and attempted to tackle it onto the ground. I barely caught it before it hit the floor, and the dive to do so kind of knocked the wind out of me. Since then, he's seemed a bit more anxious of the museum, but at the same time, he's been scratching at the door whenever I'm near it. I know some of the items in the museum do make him uncomfortable. He usually avoids those if he's in there, or if he really doesn't like something, he'll hiss at it. But he's never actually tried to break something. Anyway, about my list. I think there are some names on here that aren't really likely to get asked for naturally in the comments, so I figured when I get the itch to tell a secret and there's no requests, I'll pull from those names. So, let me introduce you to Brigham. This was a couple years into my new career, so by this point, I actually had started renting an office space for meetings and had a dedicated cell phone for business calls. I also had a bigger circle of funeral homes willing to hand out my info and recommend me, so while I wasn't exactly booked solid, I had fairly frequent jobs, but I still remember Saris. She was Brigham's wife and clearly was dealing with some intense grief surrounding his death. She still lived in the house with her youngest son, who was helping her with the necessary estate business whenever he could. So she actually wasn't calling me about the house. Instead, she wanted me to clear out his workshop out behind the house, a large shed where he kept all his tools and the things he needed for his hobbies. It was much harder to tackle than the house was and still felt like his space. The kids were too upset to do it as well, and I quickly gathered that the family had been very close-knit, with Brigham having been a doting husband and father to all three of their children. Hell, the youngest one was only a sophomore in college, so they certainly hadn't lost any of the spark in their marriage. So when she explained the job through several pauses for tears, I of course agreed to start as soon as she was ready. When I arrived just before afternoon the next day, when both of them would be home and easy to check in with about any important finds in his workshop, the son was the one to greet me. Before I could ask, he clarified that Mom was going through pictures for the funeral that weekend and was having a lot of difficulty with it, so he was going to take over for any other business that day. He was nice enough, took me through the house, and offered me a water before heading out to the shed, but he didn't seem to be handling his dad's death much better than his mom. There were deep, dark circles under eyes that were slightly red from either crying or rubbing at them, and when his stomach growled loudly enough for me to hear it, I gently joked that while I was working, he should have enough time to get some lunch in him. He just kind of smiled at me, and I knew he probably hadn't had a meal he enjoyed in a few days. When we got to the shed that served as his workshop, I had to admit, I was a bit impressed. The shed seemed to have been a repurposed garage, at least judging by the door he had next to the main entrance, and through the window, I could see an older red car that I couldn't quite identify from outside the building. If I had to guess, it was a bit bigger than a two-car garage, with the part of the shed next to the garage door, and clearly had been customized by the man himself. I whistled to myself in appreciation and got the first genuine smile since I'd met the kid. "My dad did a good job, huh?" he asked with a hint of pride. "Yeah. Did you have the garage back here to start with?" "A one-car one with a path, but it's way past grown over now. It already was when I was old enough to play back here. So Dad usually just put whatever he was working on in neutral and pushed where the path used to be to the workshop, and the grass would be flat for a few days whenever he did." I could see the kid's eyes glistening at the memory, so I went back to business. "So I have the sheet your mom filled out, but is there anything you want to add?" He rubbed his eyes with the heel of his palm roughly and shrugged, so I dug the form out of my backpack for him to look over as I checked to make sure I didn't need to bother the two of them for any supplies I'd forgotten. "She doesn't want anything but the papers for his estate stuff?" I stopped and leaned over to read it. "That's what it looks like, yeah. Didn't list any personal items or furniture anyway." "What about his tools? The crafts he kept out there? Does she just want you to throw them out?" I could see he was getting heated, and I put a hand on his shoulder. "Just tell me what you want to add. I only throw out what's obviously trash before I move on to donations and such." He took a deep breath before answering. I want both of those. His tools, and whatever crafts he had finished. I don't think I'd be able to finish any of the half-done ones. Consider it done. Besides, you're both home, so before I take anything with me that isn't trash, I'll run it by whoever feels like they can handle checking." He considered me for a moment before handing back the form, face calm again. "Thanks. I appreciate that. Of course, I've been here too. It's not the best position to be in. I promise I won't make it any harder." He nodded a little and gestured at the shed as if to say, "All yours then," before heading back inside. I couldn't tell if what I said had helped, but at least I hadn't made things any worse. I took a deep breath breath before heading in and immediately letting out a soft, "whoa," under my breath. It was certainly a sight to behold in there, along with the car Brigham had been working on, which I now recognize to be a 1998 Ferrari Berlinetta. He had shelves upon shelves of tools, things he had made, boxes of who knew what, and a nice workbench right in the middle with a comfy enough looking chair. The side without the car and its tools and such made me think of Geppetto's workshop from the older Disney version, just with more variety than just toys. In fact, other than some scraps from whatever he'd been working on, along with some sawdust and unusable bits scattered on the floor, there wasn't really a need for garbage to be collected. I can't say I didn't appreciate it. As I said, my favorite part came after the first round of cleaning, and it took me less than an hour to get things sorted so I could start digging. Brigham certainly was a man who knew how to work with his hands. In one of the boxes marked Beauties, he had the folded up specs of the past cars he'd worked on, along with a before and after picture, and damn, he cleaned those old girls up good. They damn near looked new by the time he was done. From what I could find, he seemed to take them to car shows when he was done to sell them to someone who'd appreciate his hard work, and I nearly shed a tear when I found evidence that each sale had been stashed away for his kids, either for them to go to college or for them to get when they moved out. There were some wood carvings he'd painted on the shelves, all arranged in a way that implied his progress, based on the quality anyway. And although the first few were pretty rough, there was a bear one at the end with a cardinal on his outreached paw that I was tempted to take for myself. That's not how I work, though. I couldn't imagine his family not wanting them, particularly considering how his youngest son acted. Some other highlights included a stack of finished and glued together puzzles that were in frames like portraits, some model planes that looked like they could take off any moment, and a single ship in a bottle that he'd somehow set up to look like it was on a stormy sea, using some kind of material along the bottom and some careful painting on the bottle itself. They were all beautiful and a clear labor of love, but my things are secrets. I put each item I found in organized boxes that I'd either brought folded in my bag or happened to be in the workshop, taking great care to keep them intact and safely put away, and went on to the last thing I had to check aside from the car itself, that workbench, and I hit the goddamn jackpot. I know a lot of workbenches are different, so I'll describe this one really quickly so that everything makes sense. It was made of dark wood, maybe mahogany or something, and while one side was just a tabletop and a chair, the other was a set of 3 drawers, which means that was my main focus. The first drawer was pretty mundane, if I'm being honest, mostly pencils, pens, and paintbrushes, along with some scattered odds and ends like buttons, a small pocket knife, and a few screws. Probably just things he either only used at the desk or picked up and tossed in without thinking about it. The other 2, though, had locks. Now, this was unusual, especially since they seemed to have been added later, rather than coming with the workbench to begin with. I mean, it made sense since the first drawer didn't have a lock to speak of, but there also hadn't been any keys in that first drawer, and that was more of an issue. I dug around that desk and a few of the individual boxes I had taken down from the shelves, despite knowing there was none in the boxes either, and was about to give up when I looked at the desk from the floor for the first time. There, under the chair, was an out-of-place strip of silver duct tape that stood out against the otherwise soft gray of the swivel chair. I crawled over to check it out and ended up pulling the tape away altogether, and my efforts were rewarded with a small key nestled in the tape that had been on the chair. Not exactly a normal way to store a key, which meant I absolutely had to see what was in those drawers. As the first unlatched, I was disappointed at first to see they appeared to be business-related letters from over the years, along with progress notes for some of his projects and other paperwork. The guy had been a contractor up until retirement just a few years ago, and the paperwork appeared to be a mixture of personal jobs and ones he'd been hired onto. Still, my job was to sort these kinds of things. I started to separate the letters, invoices, and progress notes into personal and professional jobs, along with sorting out the dates chronologically when I actually paid attention to one. Incident report for redacted address on the 8th of June, 1979. On June 8th, at approximately 9:13 a.m., an unknown individual in a long jacket, hat, and sunglasses approached the site from the wooded area near the house. This man had not been scheduled to be there by any member of the crew, nor had the owners of redacted address let us know to expect anyone aside from the owners, Owen and Lara, last name redacted, their 2 children, and a medium-sized dog that would be kept inside as a precaution while we were working. Being the lead contractor on the job, I approached the individual to ask him why he was there, and if necessary, requested he leave the premises. Normally, I wouldn't do this since the owners could always have invited someone over or had an unexpected guest, but due to him having come from the woods in clothing that wasn't appropriate for that kind of activity, I wanted to be cautious. When asked about his business, the man replied that he needed directions to the road. The road in question was within sight of the home, though it was admittedly situated on a long driveway, and giving him the benefit of the doubt, I pointed him in that direction and told him that if he followed the driveway down from the house, it wouldn't take him more than a few minutes minutes to hit the road. In response, he asked if I or one of the crew could walk him to the road. Again, this road is within sight, and I had given him some fairly straightforward directions to get to it. I asked him if he could see all right, and he responded that his eyes were sensitive to the light, hence the hat and glasses. Since he had said a bit more in order to explain this, it was about this time that I realized that something didn't feel right. I can't really explain it in words other than it was like when you watch one of those B movies where the actors don't seem to have a hang of acting yet. There was emphasis on weird syllables, or his voice would be overly emotional or monotone at what seemed like random intervals. It didn't feel right. I told him that he should be able to find the road just fine, and that we were on the clock for a job and couldn't afford to talk too long or walk him down. He just kind of stood there for a moment, and I assume he was staring at me from behind those glasses before nodding and letting me go back to work. I looked back once I got back to what I'd been working on to see if he was heading the way I'd told him, and barely caught him stepping back into the tree line for the woods. If we could get a few cameras to monitor the site, with client permission, of course, I think that might be wise. Brigham redacted. I read it over a few times, confused, before seeing if I could find the response. It was right next to it and looked like it had been paperclipped to the report at one point. Brigham, as much as I appreciate you trying to look after the crew and the clients, a weirdo coming out of the woods and then going back in because he couldn't get back to the road isn't exactly a threat, and I sure as hell am not putting cameras up around these folks' houses just for a weirdo. I'll tell you what though, those woods are public property about 50 yards in. If anything else happens, I'll give you one of my hunting cameras to set up out there as a favor. Keep up the good work. Sean redacted. As dismissive as it was, I couldn't exactly blame the guy for brushing off a weird report like that. While I would probably be just as unsettled in that situation, Sean was right. It wasn't a threat. I picked up another paper, and it was from the same job, but a week or two later. Incident report for redacted address on the 17th of June, 1979. On June 17th, at approximately 6:28 p.m., while the crew was wrapping up for the day, the individual described in a prior report, see incident report for redacted address from 8th of June, 1979, again approached the site from the woods. This time, he only had his hat, seeing as it was late in the day, but had it pulled down so his eyes couldn't be seen without active effort. I approached the individual and asked why he was there, admittedly a bit harshly after his behavior last time, and he asked if there was a river nearby. There was a stream not far from the property that cut through the wooded area he'd come from, so I told him so before adding that I wasn't sure where the nearest proper river was. He asked if I or one of the crew could bring him there. I can't explain it, but I got a chill up my spine. It felt like he was trying to think of a better way to get someone to go off with him alone, since the stream wasn't within sight like the road was. I sure as hell didn't trust it after how weird he acted last time. I told him pretty firmly that we were about to wrap up and leave, and that we didn't have time to walk him however far we were from the stream. Last time he seemed confused, but this time he was a bit more pushy. He insisted that if we were about to wrap up, then he could wait for someone to walk him over after we were done, and that he would do his best not to take up too much time for whoever did. His voice had sounded pretty normal up until now, but when argued with me, it started to jump around again like a B-movie actor. I told him a firm no, and that the owners needed us off the property by 7 p.m., which was mostly true, so he needed to leave. He stared at me for a lot longer this time, or at least I assume he stared at me, before letting out a very slow and low, "Thank you for your time," and walking backwards into the woods. Just kept facing me the whole damn time until the trees blocked my view. If you meant it about that camera, please, I'll even pay you for it. Brigham. Redacted. I dug into the pile a bit more eagerly now, but there didn't seem to be anything else from that job other than the breakdown of cost, general progress report, and a handwritten receipt for the camera that made it clear he really had bought it. No pictures, though, which was a shame. Now there was a window above the workbench that was likely to help Brigham keep track of time and feel a bit less confined, though I might be projecting a bit. And I had been half turned away from it at this point since I had just started sorting from the floor. As I went back to my normal pattern for sorting, maybe because of the letters, I didn't feel comfortable facing away from it anymore. Since I was sorting anyway, I moved my operation to the bench itself and resumed what I was doing. After a few uneventful jobs worth of paperwork, there was another incident report from a different job 2 years after the one I'd read. Incident report for redacted address on the 5th of September, 1981. Sorry, Sean, but this is not going to be a normal incident report this time. I'm still pretty freaked out by this. It happened just before 11 a.m., I think 10:56 a.m., but I'm honestly just guessing. Do you remember that guy from the redacted address job? The guy in the woods. He showed up, Sean. He fucking showed up at this place. This place like 10 fucking miles away, next to an entirely different set of woods. I looked up at one point, and he was just there. He was still in that long jacket, with his hat pulled down over his eyes, and he had a scarf now that hid his mouth a bit too. I immediately went over to the guy he was talking to, that new kid that started with us, and I managed to hear him asking the kid if he'd seen a dog. I asked him what the hell he was doing on the property, and I think he recognized me, because his whole demeanor changed. He went from a bit stiff stiff, but open to an almost defensive stance, and his voice was low. He said he was seeing if anyone had seen a dog. I asked him what kind, and he said a little brown one, but when he tried to describe it, the thing sounded more like a deer. I told him no one's seen one, and that he needed to leave, and he took a step towards me as he stared at me, like he was trying to intimidate me. I didn't back down, and the kid was looking between us nervously, and eventually the guy said he'd leave, and nodded at the kid. I tried to reassure the kid it was just some weirdo, same as you did after the guy first showed up, but when I looked behind him, this guy looked wrong, like his legs and arms were too long, and he was taking these huge backward steps while he looked at me, and I swear to God, he fucking smiled at me. I can't deal with this shit again, Sean. If he shows up again, I'm out. Brigham redacted. A part of me remembered that whole Slender Man thing that was popular when I was younger, and I almost laughed, but the fear in this report stopped me. The last two reports were a little shaken, especially the second one, but this, it sounded like he was terrified of this guy. As if by reflex, I looked up at the window and felt a little dumb when it was the same as it had been before I started reading, aside from a bit darker. I probably would have to wrap up soon, but I desperately wanted to finish these so I'd know how many of these to put aside. The next paper was his letter of resignation. Sean, I'm sorry. It's been great working with you, but I'm done. I told you if that thing showed up again, I was out, and I'm out. I know you don't believe me, even with the kid backing me up, and the fact you would say I was hazing him to make you believe this prank honestly was the last straw. You weren't there. You didn't talk to this thing, didn't see this thing, and you never believed the pictures from the last few days of the redacted last name job. So I'm done. I'll get my tools after the job is over so the guys can use them, but once it's over, I'm picking them up. I thought we were friends, Sean. I thought that you'd believe me with all the goddamn proof I put on your desk after the last time. I guess I was wrong. Best of luck, man. Brigham redacted. The letter was handwritten in quick, shaky letters that made me think he had been upset when he wrote it, and the fact that it looked like it had been crumpled up at one point gave the impression that this hadn't been the actual letter he turned in. Even if it wasn't, it said a lot about this thing and how much it bothered him. Not only that, it said there were pictures somewhere. Again, I shuffled through the pile to see if there was anything there, and again, I came up empty. Worse, I knew there wouldn't be any more incident reports. I started organizing again, wanting to get to the last drawer, and something came up a few years later that caught my attention. Notice to all employees of redacted last name, contracting and landscaping, effective on February 11th, 1987. The following protocol is now in place. Any unfamiliar personnel approaching a site must be immediately reported to myself or the lead contractor for that particular site. All employees must also report any strange activity in the surrounding area or signs of tampering with any tools, equipment, or personal items. Anyone seen talking to unfamiliar personnel will receive a disciplinary warning, and anyone seen accompanying them off-site will receive serious disciplinary action in addition to removal from the site for the remainder of the job. This protocol is for the safety of staff and clients and will not be treated lightly. Any questions about this change should be directed at myself by requesting a private meeting. Thank you for your compliance, and let's continue to do our best work. Brigham redacted last name. What had happened in those 6 years that he would mention going with someone off-site? Why did he emphasize it was for staff and client protection? I didn't know, and there was no guarantee that I would find out, but God did I hope so. After this, there were a handful of reports, some from the same job, and others from ones that were months to years apart, and they were short due to the fill-in form that Brigham had seemed to whip up after this notice. This is what the blank ones looked like. Name, position, date. Description of incident. It was roughly the size of one of those feedback sheets you might get from a doctor's office, about half of a normal sheet of printer paper. Still, what there was to find was telling. Name, Peter redacted position, apprentice contractor site, redacted address. Date, November 10th, 1987. Description of incident. While I was waiting for my trainer to get back from his lunch break, a guy in a hat and jacket came up to me. I'm not sure where he came from since I just finished lunch too. He asked me if I knew where the nearest house was, I'm assuming other than the one he was at, and when I told him how far it was, he asked me to bring him over. My trainer came back around then and cussed him out, and the guy walked off. No idea where to go though. It was basically the opposite direction of the road. Name, Morgan redacted position, painter site, redacted address. Date, April 28th, 1988. Description of incident. While I was walking back to the site from my car, a guy walked out from the woods and asked me for help. When I asked what was wrong, he said he was lost and needed to use a phone. When I told him we didn't have permission to go in the house, he asked me to drive him to a store or something to use their phone. I went to ask you about it, and by the time I came back with you, he was gone. Name, Elliot redacted position, assistant contractor site, redacted address. Date, March 7th, 1992. Description of incident. My car had a slashed tire when I went to head out for the day, and some guy in a coat came up and offered to help me fix it or bring me where I needed to go. He wasn't with us or the client, so I have no idea where the hell he came from. I said no and went to ask one of the crew for help, and I saw him go into the woods. Name, Theo, redacted position, landscaping site, redacted address. Date, March 10th, 1993. Description of incident, my wife came with the baby to drop off lunch, and when she got back to the car, some guy was holding my daughter. She started freaking out and shouting at him, but he ignored her and started taking the baby towards the woods. Luckily, I heard her and ran at the guy, and it's kind of a blur after that. My wife can't really tell me what happened either. My daughter was in my arms, and fine other than crying. The guy was gone. I stopped at that last one. It honestly made me a bit sick. I couldn't imagine being in that situation, seeing someone I cared about be so vulnerable and in such a strange position. I couldn't imagine what the hell happened to make him and his wife forget either. Again, I felt the urge to look back at the window. Nothing seemed disturbed, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away like it had before. I suddenly wanted to get through this as soon as possible. I finished organizing the papers, only finding a few more reports that were worth setting aside, and was finally ready for that last drawer. I wish I had left it locked sometimes. The pictures that were mentioned before were there, presumably from the hunting camera he bought off of his old boss, and they were unsettling to say the least. A few were just bits it had caught as the guy went by. A blurry hand at the end of a long sleeve, the top of a hat, a vague humanoid shape in the distance. But there were two that really stood out. In one, he was standing in front of the camera as if he was posing. He wasn't particularly tall or thin, but something about his proportions just seemed off. And after looking at it for a bit, I remembered what one of the reports had said, and realized it was because his legs and arms were just a little too long for his body. The jacket was more like a trench coat and almost went to his ankles, a dark gray that was just light enough to not be black, and the hat he wore looked like a fedora. In fact, he kind of reminded me of a stereotypical detective that gets up aside from the coat not being brown or beige. Even the sunglasses fit with this look. While I was looking at the sunglasses, I noticed his nose was barely differentiated from the rest of his face, and his smile seemed too wide. The other picture, on the other hand, I might as well be looking at it, even knowing it's in one of the decorative boxes the family didn't want. The man was on all fours, arms and legs twisted and in odd angles like a spider, and the glasses had fallen off to reveal he had no eyes. No fucking eyes. Just the indents where they were supposed to be in his skull, and these small holes that reminded me of the dots you put on a smiley face. And God, that smile. That smile was so wide it literally stretched from ear to ear, and the toothy grin felt like it had far more teeth than it should have, even though they didn't even look sharper than a normal human. It took a bit to realize his head was too far tilted as well, as if it had been glued to the side of his neck instead of attached normally. It felt like that fucking thing could see me through the picture. I hated looking at it. I hated it looking at me. I stuffed it somewhere in the center of the others. The only other thing in that drawer was a newspaper article from February 2nd, 1987. An article about a middle schooler who had gone missing right from her own yard. One who was last seen talking to a man in a jacket and hat, according to her mother, who seemed to be asking the girl for directions. I was done. I couldn't read anymore. I put anything else that looked like it might make the family as sick as I felt aside to take with me, and started to bring the boxes out to go over the contents with the family before nightfall. The son was at the door to the workshop as I opened it, looking like he had been about to knock. "Oh, sorry, man. I hope I didn't scare you," I apologized. "No, I was just wondering if you had anyone else working with you." I felt cold, ice cold. When I tried to swallow, there suddenly wasn't enough spit to even do that. No, why? There was this guy outside of the shed before I came out here to ask you if he was with you. Looked like a cop or something, maybe? It seemed like he was looking in like he wasn't sure if he should knock or something," the kid explained, seeming as confused as I was. "A cop? Well, I mean, not like a normal cop. He had on one of those coats from old detective movies, so I wasn't sure how else to describe him. I think that's the fastest I've ever wrapped up a job, though I did at least warn them that if they saw that guy that he wasn't with me and to call the cops. I wasn't sure what else to tell them. Hey, your husband-oss dad seemed to have pissed off some eldritch abomination. Maybe it's not sure if he's dead. What the hell is the point of taking those secrets with me then? The box stays in one of my shelves in the museum now. Usually, I try to forget it's there. When I remember, I usually have nightmares or get paranoid there's someone outside. I hope that's not the case tonight, especially since I had to get the notes to type them up. If you have any questions or a name you'd like to check, feel free. I might like the company, just in case I do have trouble sleeping. Part 3. The Death Collector. I got pretty busy with a new job recently, but I'm finally ready to share more secrets. Well, it hasn't all been work, to be honest. There was a very long night filled with nightmares about what I guess I'll refer to as the trenchcoat man, but it seems to have subsided after I put everything away and put out some meat again. I was also able to get some holy water to sprinkle carefully on Teresa, and ever since it only came on once with a short sermon from the kind woman preacher. If memory serves, the sermons will be sparse and mild again for a few months. Anyway, I'm glad to say I finally got my first request. for an Allen. It's not spelled the same, but I actually do have two. The first one is short and a lot lighter compared to my other secrets, so I'll share that first. This man, Allen, was a former butcher from Pennsylvania that was insistent on looking for something called a squonk so he could cheer it up. I had no idea what those were going into that particular home, but after digging around a bit, I found plenty of art, stories, and accounts he'd collected to try and track one down. Honestly, all the more power to him. I wanted to cheer one up myself after hearing about how miserable the poor things are. In case you're as in the dark as I am, these are wrinkled pig-like creatures with warts and moles on their baggy skin that have webbed left feet for some reason and cry all the time. And I mean all the time. They can even be tracked down by following trails of tears and dissolve into a whole puddle of them when someone tries to catch them. Poor creatures. If I ever run into one, I made a promise to try to cheer it up for Alan on his behalf. And anytime I come across a puddle or trail of water where it shouldn't be, I joke to myself that I must have scared off a squonk. He only had one kid that was still in Pennsylvania and wasn't able to make the trip to his dad's house, especially with the hassle he was already dealing with getting his dad's body across state lines. But I actually gave him the collection of notes and such when I saw him, and we had a good laugh about it. One of the few secrets that I thought a family would actually like to know. Last I heard from Jeffrey, he still attends Squonkapalooza in Johnstown as a way of sharing something with Alan now that he's gone. I hope he ends up finding one. But I already know those aren't the kinds of secrets you're hoping to hear. After all, they aren't the kind that I keep in the museum to start with. Still, I hope it gave you a laugh. Now, let's talk about Alan, aka Alan with an E, for the purposes of my records. I was actually contacted in person for this case, a relative rarity. I forget why exactly I was in the office, probably doing some of the paperwork side of the job if I had to guess, when a tall woman with dark brown eyes suddenly opened the door and walked purposefully to my desk. The sudden intrusion made me jump, and I remember her eyes the most because they had me pinned in place with the level of intensity she had in them. Can I help you? I asked, unusually nervous. She put one of the cards on the desk and slid it towards me. Callahan recommended you, said you can clear out houses for families of the deceased. I nodded. Callahan was in my circle of funeral homes. A timid kind of guy that was balding and wore glasses. Poor guy must have been shaking if this was how the woman always was. My name is Alicia. I need the house of my father, Alan, cleaned out. That should be fine. I just need you to fill out. I wasn't able to finish my statement because as soon as I had the form on the desk, she had taken it from me to read through. Just as quickly, it was back in my hand with her only having filled out the consents. Are you sure you don't? Positive. Donate it, trash it, burn it, take it yourself for all I care. My sister should be there getting whatever paperwork we need for the estate today, so by the time you come tomorrow, we'll have whatever it is we need. Despite her demeanor, I couldn't help myself. I had to ask. I'm getting the sense you weren't close. Her jaw tightened slightly, and her mouth briefly became one thin line as her eyes hardened impossibly more than they were. He's been dead to me and my siblings for years. His body just finally followed suit, so can you come tomorrow or not? Yes. I just need the specs, so I know how much to charge. I read the form. His house is 2,015 square feet, and I'm fine with paying whatever that and the cost of labor comes out to, as long as neither me nor my siblings need to step foot in there after today. I was a bit taken aback and checked the form again. Sure enough, the number she gave me was already written down next to the information for cost per square foot at baseline. I hadn't even seen her fill it. My mistake. Thank you for letting me know. I can be there tomorrow at 10 a.m. if that works for you. She seemed to finally untense somewhat, and with it, her eyes softened. Yes, that should be fine. My number is the one written down in case you have any questions, but honestly, unless it's money or something we missed for the estate, none of us really care about what's there. I made a note of that in the form as I double-checked the number, which actually was there too, despite the short time she had the form. I was impressed. She was quick. Perfect. Thank you, Alicia. I'll make sure not to bother you unless it's important so you don't have to worry. Another level of tense seemed to come off of her and she actually smiled. Thank you. Of course, after that kind of introduction, I was both excited and nervous to see what there was to find at this house. It wouldn't have been my first time having to bring something to the police if need be, but I was hoping that wouldn't be necessary, given the level of hostility Alicia had given to just the idea of her father. That kind of hate, combined with needing to involve the police, would lead to more than a few sleepless nights spent questioning humanity and whether there's good in the world. I'd rather avoid an existential crisis if I could help it. The house was a nice country-style old ranch house, situated within eyesight of another house on each side, but enough of a walk that visiting would take some effort. The wraparound porch was cozy and welcoming, a rocking chair set out there with a small outdoor table near the door, and I had to be careful not to knock over the single plant on the second to last step. It must have been lonely here at times, but I honestly was a little jealous of this place. A note on the door let me know where they hid the key for me and had the signatures of two other people I hadn't met, presumably Alicia's siblings, Charlie and Maisie. I never had a chance to ask, but I still wonder if Maisie was short for something. Inside was spotless spotless aside from some disturbed dust. Either Alan himself had kept it damn clean, or his kids had tried to make my job easier. But the dust made me think that Alan was the tidy one. Couldn't complain though. Let me get right to work. There were no pictures on the walls, and I noticed after a few rooms that there hadn't been any before I came either, with no telltale holes, nails, screws, or off-color squares to make where they'd been. In fact, the rooms themselves seemed to only have what they needed in terms of the basics: chairs, a few tables, a bookshelf or two full of poetry books with some other volumes scattered in between, refrigerator, that kind of stuff. Minimal decorations. Kind of boring, honestly. It wasn't until I went upstairs that I noticed the rifle by the door, almost hidden by the coat rack it was leaning against. Damn, I'd have to turn that in with some paperwork to the nearest police department. Firearms tend to be a huge pain. On a hunch, I went to find the back door and found it in the kitchen, with an axe upright against the trash can. Okay, not another firearm, but almost weirder. The guy had a fireplace, sure, but keeping that in the house wasn't exactly the norm. I dug in my backpack for a makeshift inventory list and marked down the rifle before continuing upstairs, a little disappointed with how easy this house seemed to be. Upstairs was more of the same, another bathroom roughly above where the downstairs one was, and what looked like a storage room that I planned to save for last. The only other door seemed to be the man's bedroom, so that's where I went first. More basic furniture, all wooden, but I was pleasantly surprised to see a galaxy-themed blanket folded on the bed to break up the monotony. Nothing of note under the clothes in the drawers, and a single dirty magazine under the bed that was painfully tame. As I started to lose hope that there was any discernible reason why Alan's kids hated him so much, I found a leather-bound notebook in the topmost drawer of his end table. Jackpot. I sat on the bed as I opened it and found, in between what seemed to be his own poetry, a few scattered entries from this year. They're here again. Why the hell won't they just leave me alone? I don't even answer them anymore, and yet they just keep knocking. I made a big show of loading my rifle as loudly as possible near the front door, but they didn't even pause this time. They know I won't open it. They know I don't want to see them. So then why do they even bother? Why are they fucking torturing me like this? I raised an eyebrow curiously. Maybe the hatred from his kids was more recent if they were the same they he mentioned in this entry. I mean, damn, if someone I cared about not only didn't want to see me, but threatened me with a gun, I'm not sure how else I would react. I skimmed through a few more pages of poetry, which seemed to be astronomy-themed, before I found another. They're coming so often now. It used to be months, even years between them showing up at my doorstep. Now I'm lucky if it's a full week. What do they want? I know they want in, but why me? Why do they want me to let them in? I'm not doing it, damn it. I don't care if I'm at death's door. They can have it after I've crossed that threshold, even if I have to hold out for hours before they stop knocking. Why was he being so stubborn? Was it really his kids he was so adamant against? I didn't know, but it was the only option I had at the moment. Several more poems, all about constellations, and then another. They're trying to keep me from sleeping. They seem to be hoping I'll crack and open the door to make it stop. You can knock all night, you little bastards. I'm not opening that fucking door. It's the windows and the back door now, too. I keep the curtains on the back door drawn so I don't see their faces. The windows are all usually closed at night anyhow, but the back door curtains are so damn sheer that I can see the outlines of them out there. I almost made eye contact with one of them, and I damn near pissed myself. Please, just go away. Just leave me alone. Why won't they just leave? Why won't they stop? I don't know if it's the stress, but I'm getting sicker. The doctor said I need more rest, but I couldn't tell him why I can't sleep. At least he gave me some sleeping pills. I can't take the pills. After a few nights, I woke up at the door with my hand on the handle. I don't remember if sleepwalking was one of the side effects, but I won't risk it. The only thing keeping me sane is writing this down and looking at all the old journals in the clutter room. It's the only reason I know that I'm not imagining this, that the cancer isn't taking my mind from me. I'm going to die soon, and they can't even let me die in peace. It's rest in peace, you little shits. Let me rest in peace. I just want peace. After all these years, please, just let me have some peace. I'll have my peace one way or another. Either you're going to kill me, or I'm going to kill you. Either way, the next time you come will be the last. Burn in hell, you little demons. I turned the next page in anticipation, but there was only a short letter. To my children, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. None of this was your fault. It was them. It was always them. But they made me afraid of you. As much as I hate to say it, the truth is that they made me hate you, hate your mother for having you. But that wasn't fair. You didn't deserve any of this. I'm so sorry. I deserve whatever you think of me. Dad, that was all. That was the last thing in the journal. Thankfully, I knew it wasn't the only one. Despite my earlier decision to save what I now knew as the clutter room for last, I needed to know who they were. I needed to know who the hell could make a man hate his own children and his own wife for having them. Were they the ones knocking? Were his kids? After digging through several boxes, I found several leather-bound journals that were similar to the one in his bedside table, mixed in with some nicer ones that seemed to have been solely for the poetry he had been writing writing prior to getting sick. After rearranging a half-assembled new telescope and a few boxes of pictures that were taped far too much, I was able to find a place to sit as I peeked at the first page of each to find the oldest one. It was pretty easy to find. Kids write pretty big after all. Dear Journal, today I got you from my mom as a birthday present. She said that I should practice my writing every night so I can be ready for first grade next year. Adam said that everyone passes kindergarten, but I bet he only said that because I worked extra hard and he wants to make fun of me. I'm going to practice a lot and I'll be the fastest writer in first grade. Dear Journal, today I went swimming with Adam at the pond near Judy's house. Judy is really nice even though she is a big kid like Adam. He told me big kids don't like to play with little kids because we aren't as smart, but Judy said that she thought I was fun. I hope we go swimming at the pond with Judy and real soon. The next few passages were cute, but more of the same. Adam seemed to be his older brother and teased him a lot, and he seemed to be developing a crush on Judy for being nice to him. There were a lot of stories of them going to the parks or the pond together, sometimes with a few other kids, and it became very clear that poor Alan didn't have a lot of, or maybe any, friends his age. Dear Journal, I had to play at home by myself today. Adam said that he wants to do something without having to bring a little kid. It's not fair. Lucky for me, Judy was home and she used to play with me. We made drawings at her house on the sidewalk. Dear Journal, I found a spelling book from when Adam was in first grade, and I've been practicing the sum of the harder words, but I'm trying not to cheat when I'm writing to you so I can see how much better I'm doing. That way I have something to do when Adam goes to play without me. Jesus, why did Adam hate his brother so much? This was really sad. It almost made me want to call my brother and make sure I didn't do this kind of shit when we were kids. I skipped a few entries that were more of the same, though I did notice his spelling was getting better and found one that looked interesting. Dear Journal, today I met a new friend. He didn't tell me his name, but he was really nice. We met at the park and played on the jungle gym for a while. He has weird eyes, but I didn't say anything because I didn't want to hurt his feelings. Mom said that if someone is different, not to make them feel bad about it, but I really haven't seen anyone before where they had black on all of the eye and not just the middle part. Black on all of the eyes and not just the middle part. Does he mean like really dark brown eyes? I flipped until I found another one talking about his new friend. Dear Journal, my new friend was at the park today. We played with sticks that were on the ground and pretended they were swords. He was really good, and I accidentally asked how he was so good when all of his eyes were black. I was worried I hurt his feelings, but he said that even though his eyes were all black, he could still see, even with the white part colored in too. That's really cool. I wish my eyes were all blue like his were all black. Wait, even the white part of the eye was black? I hadn't heard of that before. I mean, except for some of those internet stories about the black-eyed children, but they always ask people to come in their cars and houses. I've never heard of them just playing with regular kids. Dear Journal, my new friend asked me about my eyes today and why they were so many colors. I said that's how everyone in the news looked. He asked me if I wanted to have eyes like his instead, and I said that he was being silly because you can't make your eyes different. He said he had brothers and sisters who had eyes like him, and that some of them didn't have eyes like that before. I asked what they were like before, and he said they were like mine, but that they were bigger kids. So he didn't know how they did it, and he cooed. Ask if they would make mine like his. I asked if they could make them go back after, but he said he didn't know. I said it was okay to ask because I'd like them to be all black for a little while, but if they can make them all blue instead, I would do it, even if they stayed that way. Dear Journal, my new friend isn't my friend anymore. When I went to see him at the park, there were a bunch of kids with him that had all black eyes like he did. He said that they wanted to meet me. I was a little scared, but I said, "Hi, my name is Alan," like you're supposed to do when you meet someone new. They didn't say anything, but they all looked at each other, and some of them nodded and looked at the kid. The kid said they liked me and wanted me to be his new brother. I said I already had a brother, and I thought they were going to see if I could have black eyes for a little bit. He said it'd be forever, but wood makes us brothers, and they'd all be nicer than Adam, and wood never leaves me by myself like Adam. It sounded nice, but all of them looking at me made me feel all cold, so I said no. The kid got real mad, and I got scared and ran home. They followed me and kept knocking on the door and telling me to let them in, and Mom was at work, and I started crying because I was so scared. Then Adam came in the back door and asked me why I was crying. I said I was scared of the kids outside with black eyes, and when he looked, they were gone. I thought he would make fun of me, but he gave me a hug and said I could play with him, so I wouldn't see them again. I love Adam, and I'm glad he's my brother, and not the kids with black eyes. As heartwarming as that was, I felt a chill run up my spine. It felt wrong reading about such a little kid being so afraid and trying to describe what was clearly dread. And those kids, they wanted to make him one of them. I shuddered and skimmed the rest of the journal. But the kids with black eyes didn't show back up in this book. Well, there were 5 more of them. I had a feeling they'd be in there somewhere. It looked like he was in middle school when they showed up again. Dear Journal, today was the first time I've looked at my old journal in a long time. I had to, though. I thought I was crazy. But I'm glad I did because it proves I'm not. While I was walking home today from school with Kyle and Owen like usual, we were talking about the cute new girl in our math class and guessing who she was going to end up liking. I said it was going to be me, and when Kyle went to argue, he stopped and was looking across the street. I looked to see why he looked so scared, and I saw 3 kids our age looking at us from across the street. They had black eyes, and it all hit me about what happened the summer before first grade. I forgot all about it until now. But the kid in the middle, it was the same one from the park. He was older, but I knew it was him. He looked happy, but it didn't feel like he was really happy. It felt like the way my uncle's hunting dogs look when they're chasing a rabbit. They started to cross the street, and I told Kyle and Owen to run and started booking it home. They must have felt the same way I did because they didn't ask any questions and just ran away too. And those kids were chasing us until we split off to go to our houses. Then they just followed me and were slamming on the door, telling me to open up and that they needed me to let them in. Mom was working for a few more hours, and I didn't know where Adam was, probably at Judy's. But when I thought about going outside and running over to check, it made my legs shake. They kept at it for a while, but they gave up eventually and left, and I was so relieved I cried. I haven't cried like that in a long time, probably since the last time I saw them. Dear Journal, Kyle and Owen were really weird today when I asked about what happened on the way home. They acted like they didn't know what I was talking about, and when I kept trying to ask about it, they got mad and walked to school without me. Why would they act like it didn't happen? We all saw those kids. I had to read yesterday in the old journal again to make sure I wasn't remembering wrong or I didn't dream the whole thing, but I know I didn't. I just want them to admit it happened. I don't understand why they won't do it. I had to agree with Alan. Why the hell would they gaslight this poor kid like this if they all saw it? At least in the old journal, it looked like no one else ever saw him with the black-eyed boy. But having people you know saw it to refuse to acknowledge it must have been hard on the kid. I flipped around a bit and found another that stood out to me. Dear Journal, I had Kyle and Owen stay over tonight. They're finally asleep right now, but it's almost morning. We couldn't sleep after what happened. We were watching a movie and eating popcorn my mom made us when someone knocked at the door. My mom asked me to go get it, and when I did, I froze. It was that kid, the one with the black eyes. He had this big smile that made me think of a shark and said it wasn't nice not to invite him over with my other friends. I told him we weren't friends and he and his siblings creeped me out and that he had to leave. My mom came up behind me during it and didn't seem to notice the kid's eyes because she was just talking to him like he was a normal kid. The kid said his name was Christian and that I had invited him over and that he was sorry for being so late. I tried to get her to shut the door and tell her it wasn't true, but she told me I was being rude and that since he didn't have anything to sleep over, he could watch the movie before she brought him home. And then he was inside my house. I couldn't stop shaking as he came in, and he just kept looking around with that shark grin like he was ready to take a bit out of something. My mom nudged me to bring him to the living room with my friends, but I didn't want to. I begged her to tell him to leave, that I didn't want him here, and she yelled at me so loud that my friends came to see what was going on. They got all pale when they saw the kid, and I knew. I knew I was right, and they remembered the kid, and they saw him that afternoon. But it didn't matter. I had to bring him in, or else Mom said Owen and Kyle would have to go too. We all sat as far away from him on the couch as we could, but either he didn't notice or didn't care. Just kind of looked around when he wasn't looking at the TV and mostly looked up at the ceiling. When the movie was over, he didn't say anything and just walked out into the darkness before my mom could come out and take him home. When Mom didn't come out at all, I went to talk to her about it, but she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. Owen and Kyle talked about what happened a little to say how creepy it was and said that after they went home tomorrow, they didn't want me to talk to them ever again. I don't blame them. Dear Journal, Dad's sick. After Owen and Kyle left this morning, we heard him coughing and Mom checked on him and screamed. Adam and I went up too and saw he had coughed up blood on his pillow and was having a hard time breathing. He's in the hospital now and Mom won't tell us what's wrong with him. He was just fine after work yesterday. He even helped me pick out the movie for last night. I don't know how, but it's that kid's fault. If Dad dies, I'll kill him. I'll swear I'll kill him. Just a few days later, there was a short entry. Just one line and not even a Dear Journal to start it. I'm gonna find you, Christian, and I'm gonna kill you for what you did. There were pages upon pages after that talking about his dad, how much he missed him, and how angry he was at that kid for taking him away. He was positive that this kid had killed him somehow, that it was the kid's fault that he got sick. I get it, he was just a kid, and his dad died, and the same boy made him lose his 2 best friends, but he was so sure. He made plans and maps and diagrams about how he was going to kill this kid in between half-hearted entries, talking about how hard his mom and brother were taking things, how angry his brother got when Alan tried to tell him what he thought happened, how alone he felt. The only bright light was that his mom apparently got a dog to help the kids heal, and that the dog became his best friend not long after. Nothing else showed up about the black-eyed boy aside from the occasional reference to his quest for revenge until midway through high school, about a fifth of the way in the 3rd journal. Dear Journal, I found him. Well, okay, Blitz found him. But the kid finally showed his fucking face after all this time. I was taking Blitz for a hike with me when he just showed up out of nowhere. I probably wouldn't have even seen him if Blitz hadn't stopped and started growling. Just like last time he was older, but it was him. And he had that damn grin on his face that he had the night he killed Dad. He said it had been a long time and asked about Blitz. But after so long, I was not in the mood to talk. I told him that he had a lot of fucking nerve to show his face after what he did to my dad, and he actually stopped smiling for a second. I don't think it was actually because he felt bad, though. I think he didn't expect me to realize it was him. He said he was sorry to hear about my dad, but he didn't do it. He just wanted to see his old friend and watch a movie that night. Bullshit. He knows it was his fault. I told him I didn't know how he killed Dad, but that I knew it was him, that maybe he was still pissed that I didn't want to be like him, but that now he was going to pay for what he did. I was so pissed off when he started smiling again, a condescending smile like a fucking adult explaining to a kid why he can't have ice cream for dinner. He told me that it was impossible, but that he would forgive me for saying that if I went with him this time, that it would be too late soon, and if that happened, things would be a lot worse for me. That was when Blitz attacked him. It all happened so fast that I didn't have a chance to even react. Blitz just leapt at him and tried to bite him, maybe because he was trying to protect me. The kid's eyes went wide, but before Blitz could get him, he was just gone. It wasn't possible, but he was just gone. And then I heard him whisper in my ear that he'd be here if I changed my mind. But when I swung at him, he was gone again. I'm going to make him pay on my next hike, but just in case I'm going to leave Blitz at home. I don't want that fucker to hurt him. A few entries passed with him hyping himself up, including a guilt-ridden and righteous entry detailing stealing his dad's rifle for the grim task, before an entry in shaky writing. Another entry with no "Dear Journal" to preface it. I fucked up. I fucked up so bad. I swear I didn't know. I'm so sorry, Judy. I'm so sorry, Adam. I'm so sorry, Alex. I'm so fucking sorry. You didn't deserve this. You all didn't deserve to pay for what I did. Before I could think about it too much, the next entry started, bookmarked by a laminated prayer card they give out at funerals. A card for a 2-year-old boy named Alex, with the same last name as Alan. I couldn't remember the context of who that was in the older entries, other than knowing that I'd seen it before, but the entry behind it was heartbreaking. Dear Journal, I haven't been able to write until after the funeral. I couldn't look at those entries and remember how selfish I was, how stupid I was. I know that I didn't know any better, that if I had known I would have never risked doing this, but it still feels like it was my fault, because it is. It's all my fault. I tried to apologize to Adam and Judy, and Adam started screaming at me and ended up breaking my nose after the funeral. Judy just looked so broken, so sad. Every time I think about her face that day, it hurts a little more. I don't think Adam will ever talk to me again. He doesn't believe me, and he accused me of trying to add his loss to my insane personal narrative about that kid. But it doesn't matter. At least he won't be at risk anymore, and hopefully Judy can heal. Considering what happens every time this kid shows up, I should probably write it down and confess my sins. No priest would forgive me anyway, and they shouldn't. I should never be forgiven. I went to the hiking trail, and he was there. He was waiting, just like he said he would. I came alone, and I brought Dad's gun with me, thinking it would be justice for his gun to be what took down his killer. Stupid. Fucking stupid. The kid was grinning that fucking shark grin at me, and before he could even open his mouth, I shot him with the rifle in the gut. His shirt turned black around the area where the buckshot had torn open his clothes and flesh, but there wasn't anything else. No guts, no pouring blood, nothing but the clear evidence that he had been shot plain as could be in his stomach. He coughed up some black liquid that looked almost like tar and braced himself on the tree. And he laughed. He fucking laughed at me. He laughed hard and long and said that a no would have already made things bad for me, but that I had no idea how bad shooting him was going to be. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. I tried to level my gun again and shoot him in the head, but he dropped down, and I just made a hole in the tree he was bracing himself on. I ran over to try and finish him, and he was gone. All that was left was some drops of that tar stuff he had coughed up and a few scraps of the shirt he had on. At the time, I was shocked, confused, pissed off as all hell. I had no idea what he meant. I had no idea what I'd done. When I got home, Mom was crying. Adam had called from the new place he was renting with Judy. I was confused at first because I talked to them right before they headed out camping for the next 4 days, and it was only 2 days into the trip. Adam had even joked that if it rained, that Alex had his rain boots and umbrella, and they'd go fishing until the rain stopped. So how was he calling Mom? When she managed to explain, broken up by fits of sobbing, I was pale. I felt like throwing up, and I couldn't stop the tears. While they were camping, Alex had managed to wander off while they were setting up the campfire for lunch. They didn't realize he was gone until they were finished, and both ran off to find him. But Alex was in his PJs, the little brown rabbit onesie that Judy got him before the trip as a joke, and he was hard to find. The hunter found him first. When Adam heard the gunshot, he ran in that direction, worried and hoping for the best, and found Alex with a hole the size of his whole torso on the ground, with the hunter sobbing and apologizing next to his body. Adam barely could tell he was there, though. All he could do was hold Alex and sob himself until he threw up. Judy was close enough to hear him crying and came over, and it was like she broke. She cradled his little body and was trying to wake him up, trying to wrap her jacket the hole in him, trying to pretend that she wasn't holding a dead toddler in her arms. I knew that this was what the kid meant. I knew that I was the reason Alex was dead. How the fuck could anything worse than this happen, huh, Christian? How the fuck can things be worse than this? How can things be worse when I killed my own fucking nephew? My heart dropped. I could see where he got the idea from, shooting the kid leading to his nephew getting shot too, but I couldn't imagine that weighing on me. The idea that I killed my own family, that I killed a toddler, and it didn't get any better. There wasn't an entry, but another prayer card. A card for a woman named Judy, who had been in her early 20s.
Last part, the death collector.
Sorry for the cliffhanger on the last entry, but it looked like it was going to be too long to finish in one post. Plus, I needed to take a break to move to a different room. The knocking was starting to get hard to ignore. The entry that came a page or two after the one bookmarked with Judy's prayer card looked way different than any of the ones before. Dear Journal, I understand that I am not at fault for what happened with Alex and Judy. I understand that these connections were only made out of extreme duress based on my guilt and psychotic beliefs following the death of first my father and then my nephew and sister-in-law. I know now that my death would not bring them back or cause any satisfaction to my brother Adam, who cares for me deeply despite his loss and has been a major part of my recovery, along with my mother. The black-eyed boy that I was seeing was a result of delusional thinking and hallucinations that have been properly diagnosed by Dr. Hawkins. After months of physical and mental recovery, I will be starting my journal afresh with a new mind after having it returned to me by the staff at St. Peter's Psychiatric Care Center and using the skills from my therapeutic journal to continue my recovery. The staff and Dr. Hawkins have my eternal gratitude for helping me start my life without delusion and begin my adulthood from a place of healing. After digging through the box the journals had been in, I found what looked like a workbook that I had overlooked, considering how identifiable the journals were. Inside were therapeutic exercises talking about guilt, shame, identifying how to distinguish hallucinations, countering delusional thoughts, what looked like unpolished versions of modern safety plans, entries he'd written during his treatment, and letters written back and forth between him, his mother, and his brother between visits. His brother offered him forgiveness and talked about not wanting to lose anyone else he loved. His mother talked about how strong she knew he was. Although I knew that psychiatric treatment had been far less humane in the past, the workbook was honestly inspiring, even heartwarming, at least if I didn't know where the story ended. If I didn't know there were more journals to read. Still, there were over a decade of pretty standard entries that seemed much more monumental considering the ones I'd read up until now. His brother remarried and had 2 children, one named after his father with the middle name of the son he lost, and the other with their daughter with Judy's name as her middle name. I couldn't help but wonder what the new wife thought of the latter, but considering the intensity of his loss, maybe she was understanding. Either way, there weren't any entries that were negative about it. Blitz passed away as an old man, and eventually he got his own dog named Duke that he took with him when he started his own family. Alan got a steady job as a butcher at a store he'd frequented growing up and eventually became the manager. He married, had kids that his mother often watched for them on date nights and seemed to dote on. Knowing how things were with his kids now, it was strange to see how much he wrote about them, how Alicia was so smart that it caused her trouble, how the middle daughter was already so kind, how he was so happy to have a baby boy to round out their family. It made the punch in the gut even worse when the streak broke. Dear Journal, I finally remembered. It's been so long and my treatment was so intense that I really did think I was crazy. That Christian was just something that flared up when I got too stressed, like when Dad died, or when everything happened with Alex and Judy. Some kid based on the imaginary friend I made up when Adam was getting too old to bring his little brother around. So I'd let it out of my mind for all these years. But they came tonight. It was late, maybe 10 p.m., and Rosie and the kids were all asleep. I just finished looking for Jupiter since it was a clear night. Then someone knocked on the door while I was putting away the telescope. I was worried it was an emergency since it was so late, especially with the neighbor's heart attack last week, but I damn near had one myself when I saw who was there. There were 2 little girls at the door that looked just like Alicia and Maisie, down to Maisie's hair ribbons and the studs in Alicia's ears with her birthstone in them. I knew it couldn't be them, of course. They were upstairs in their beds. But it was uncanny. I asked them what was wrong, and they said that they woke up outside and that they were scared. They even called me Daddy. They were sniffling and whimpering in a way that broke my heart to hear, and I squatted down a second to get a better look, starting to wonder if maybe they'd been sleepwalking even if that hadn't happened before. Then I saw their eyes, completely black, even what should have been the whites of their eyes. And I remembered. I slammed the door shut, and they started clawing and banging the door behind me, sobbing, letting out these keening cries for Daddy to let them in, and that I was scaring them. They were scaring me. I locked the door and ran upstairs to the girls' room while Rosie was coming out to see what was happening, and there they were. My little girls sat up in bed with that same scared, confused look as the girls on the doorstep. They were mine, though. Their eyes were teary, but they were the same eyes that had looked at me from their little bundles at the hospital the day they were born. Rosie was so worried. She kept asking why the door slammed and what all the banging was, and I told her that it was some hitchhiker wanting a ride that gave me a bad feeling. She didn't seem like she believed me, but since she didn't have a better option, she let it go. I'm on the couch writing this to make sure they don't come back, and I hope I'm just overtired. I hope to God I'm just tired, because if not, I've got no one to turn to for this. It looked like things settled down for a while again, almost long enough that he had dismissed the incident before the girls showed up again. Dear Journal, Rosie answered the door after dinner, and as I went to go into the living room, I saw who she was talking to. It was the girls again. Rosie seemed so confused and even looked back to make sure the girls were still playing on the floor near the couch, especially after I heard them beg Mommy to let them in and that they were sorry for going out without asking. I didn't hear anymore because I ran up behind her and slammed the door in their faces, the older girl barely pulling her hand off the door frame in time. Rosie got upset with me and started shouting at me for being heartless, that clearly these two little girls were confused, and I lost it. I shouted back for her to bring the girls upstairs, and that those demons were not coming into our house, that it'd be over my dead body. Our girls had never heard us fight before. Hell, we never had fought until now. And they ran upstairs like they'd seen the devil himself, and he was biting at their heels. I don't know what got into Rosie, but she was actually fighting me to get at the door. It was like something had come over her, and she was dead set on getting that door open, only made worse by those little demons crying and begging for their mother. I felt like I was going crazy, like my entire world was crashing down on me. The only thing that made me keep going and kept her away from the door is knowing what those things could do to us, to our children. And then it just stopped. The banging and the crying was gone. Rosie was staring at me from about a foot away, looking concerned, and I had my back against the door. The only thing that let me know I hadn't completely lost my mind was the scratches up and down my arms from her nails. She started asking me what was wrong, acting like those scratches were from some cat or from Duke jumping on me, and genuinely seemed like she had no idea what had happened just a few seconds before. I told her that she had come at me over those girls at the door, and I asked her if she lost her mind, but she really didn't know what I was talking about. The only thing that helped was when I went upstairs, the girls ran to me crying and asking me why Mommy and Daddy were fighting and if something bad happened. I held them for a long time, kept pulling away to look at their eyes and kiss them on their foreheads, kept telling them that Daddy loves them and that everything would be okay. I was lying to them. I don't know if anything will be okay. After this, there were entries about trying to act like everything was normal and about the nightmares he started having. Nightmares about his own little girls turning into the ones with the black eyes and shooting him in his sleep, choking the baby in his sleep, opening his wife's belly with a knife the way Alex had been shot. There were so many desperate attempts for him to separate those nightmares from his girls, and how he was worried that it was affecting how he interacted with his kids. How eventually he even started having nightmares of his baby boy opening his eyes after a nap and them being all black. Dear Journal, I think it might have gotten past the point of no return. Today the girls were playing outside with Charlie now that he's big enough to run around with them, with either Rosie or I looking out to check on them every few minutes. I was worried about those demons popping up somewhere the way they had when I was young, and Rosie was just being a good mom like she always was. I think she was actually asking me about whether I'd come up tonight instead of sleeping downstairs, and I was making up something else about my back being better on the stiffer couch. When I noticed I didn't see the kids anymore, I asked her if we could talk about it after I saw where they went off to and headed out to find them. It took a bit longer than I expected, but eventually I found them heading back towards the house, each of them holding Charlie's hand as he giggled and let them lift him up between them. It was one of the things they did as siblings that made me feel at ease whenever the nightmares made me worry, and then they looked up. It was them. I felt my knees go weak as they kept playing with my little boy, acting as if nothing was wrong, and smiling at me with the same shark-like smiles that I remembered from so long ago. This was the first time I've been near them without the door there to protect me, and I felt vulnerable, especially since they had my son. They greeted me in my daughter's voices and asked if they can bring Charlie back in and get some lemonade before they came back outside. I just kept shaking my head and thinking how this couldn't be happening, wondering where my real daughters were, when there were suddenly big bright bursts of laughter from somewhere behind me, and my girls came running from the bushes, not too far from the back door. They kept giggling at their prank and saying how their new friends wanted to help them play a trick on me and Mommy and see if we would notice before they came inside. They took their brother's hands and asked me if they spooked me good before seeing my face. I must have looked bad because they immediately got upset and started apologizing for the prank and blaming the demons for coming up with it. And I knew. I knew they had wanted to get inside and that they would have done something to hurt my family, maybe even replaced my girls. The idea had been ruminating in my nightmares, but it hadn't come to a head until that moment when the demons feigned fear at getting in trouble and ran off. I don't think I can do this anymore. Either those things are going to hurt my family, or I'm going to end up doing it myself. The entries after this were too sad to go into much detail here. The fear of his children and how he lashed out at them and their mother in return, maybe even on purpose to make them leave him. How messy the divorce was, even when he tried to let them take whatever they needed, because she had tried to take Duke from him too. The empty home after she'd won. Trying to tell his brother and mother what had happened. Fighting them tooth and nail to keep them from having him committed. Something they legally couldn't do but were trying their hardest to do anyway. The years of fear, pain, and loneliness that followed as the people he loved became more and more distant, and the black-eyed children became more and more frequent. And I knew from the last journal, and the fact I was here to begin with, where that had ended. I was torn about whether I should try to at least give his children the letter from the first journal I found, regardless of keeping the rest of the journals from them, to remove the full context. Maybe it would give them the closure they needed, even if they didn't 100% understand what he'd meant. Then I heard a giggle. My head jerked up to the window, but as expected from the second floor, there was nothing there. Still, it was the wake-up call I needed to finish my job. I put the journals aside and stacked them in order to take home with me and went to work with the usual business of dealing with the dead. Every once in a while, I thought I heard a giggle again, but I ignored it. Still, I ended up having to come back the next day to finish the job, with the giggling still seeming to follow me from room to room. When the house was empty, I was doing my last check of all the rooms, when another giggle caught my attention, closer than before. I was in the living room, so I looked out of one of the windows and saw him, a boy with black eyes and a shark-like grin. For some reason, I wasn't scared. I was furious. I had something in my hand at the time, a poetry book I'd missed or something, and I threw it at the window as hard as I could. The soft-covered book made a loud slapping sound as it hit the glass and actually made the kid jump. He looked me in the eyes almost accusingly before moving away from the window, and when I grabbed the book, he was gone. I left, not long after. Although I did offer, Alicia refused to see the letter and actually got aggressive with me when I asked if I could offer it to her siblings, but luckily it was after payment had exchanged hands. Still, I kind of wish she'd seen it. I know how hard things must have been for her and her siblings, judging by what I had glimpsed in those journals, but I couldn't help but feel bad that Alan's only apology wouldn't reach who it needed to. Of course, right on cue. No idea how they end up coordinating the knocking so that it's in so many places at once, and I'm not sure if the boy from the house or one of the other ones that come around, but it's about the time of year they start trying to get in. Hopefully, I still have a bag of assorted candy in the cabinet I can leave out after they go away for the night. In the meantime, I look forward to answering your questions and seeing the names you give me, even if it riles things up off schedule here. Thanks for tuning in to Roundup Reddit. Until next time, keep exploring the hidden stories around you.